The year was 1881, and the town of Cold Spring, nestled in the wooded valleys of New England, wore the outward face of peace. Its streets were lined with whitewashed cottages, its church bell tolled with steady rhythm, and its people, though worn from the lingering scars of the Civil War, clung to routines that gave them comfort. To a visitor passing through, Cold Spring looked like any other rural community. Hard-working farmers, pious families, children playing in the meadows after school. But beneath the surface of this quiet town lay a hunger, a desperation for healing that would make it the perfect stage for a tragedy no one could foresee. That hunger was answered by the arrival of Dr. Nathaniel Harlow. He came in the spring, stepping down from the stagecoach with a leather medical bag in one hand and a broad-brimmed hat shading his sharp features. He cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes of pale gray that seemed to weigh and measure everything they looked upon. He was in his early 40s, with streaks of silver running through his neatly trimmed beard, and he carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man accustomed to command. Cold Spring had long struggled with poor medical care. The town's only physician, old Dr. Samuel Wyeth, was frail and near retirement. His trembling hands barely steady enough to stitch wounds or deliver babies. Harlow's credentials, written in flowing ink on yellowed parchment, boasted of training at Harvard and a decade of practice in Boston's finest hospitals. Whether anyone bothered to confirm the documents was another matter. Cold Spring was too desperate to question a savior who seemed heaven-sent. Within weeks, Dr. Harlow was installed as the town's new physician, his practice set up in a sturdy brick house near the center of town. Patients flocked to him, mothers with fevers, laborers with broken bones, children with racking coughs, and Harlow treated them with methods that seemed revolutionary to Cold Spring, where Wyeth relied on bloodletting and bitter tinctures. Harlow employed powders and solutions carefully measured in glass vials. He mixed drinks that shimmered faintly green or amber, claiming they were the fruits of modern medical science. And for a time, it seemed he was a miracle worker. People who had suffered for years with chronic pains reported sudden relief. A seamstress plagued by migraines declared herself cured after a single consultation. A farmer's wife, wasting away from what seemed like consumption, regained her strength after taking one of Harlow's tonics. Word spread quickly. Dr. Harlow was not only a physician, but a healer touched by providence. His treatments became something more than medicine. They became spectacles. Patients would gather in his parlor, seated in chairs arranged like pews, while Harlow prepared his potions with theatrical precision. He would pour liquids that hissed and steamed into glasses, stir powders that glowed faintly in the lamplight, and present the finished tonic with a solemn flourish. Those who drank often felt immediate sensations, warmth flooding the veins, clarity searing through the mind, aches vanishing like snow. In Spring Sun, Harlow explained these effects with scientific logic, speaking of stimulation of vital forces and awakening of dormant energies. Most of his patients did not understand his words, but they believed his confidence. Soon, Cold Spring adored him. Families invited him to their tables, pastors praised him from the pulpit, and grateful townsfolk pooled money to buy him fine furniture and medical instruments. Where once the sick and weary had trudged to Wyeth's crumbling office, now they hurried eagerly to Harlow's door, certain they would leave renewed. But renewal came with a shadow. The first tragedy was small enough that few noticed. A young boy named Elias Carter, frail with fever, drank one of Harlow's shimmering draughts and fell into a deep sleep. His parents rejoiced, believing rest meant healing. But by morning, Elias was dead, his body cold, lips tinged blue. Harlow explained it with grave composure. The boy's illness had been too advanced, his heart too weak to endure the treatment. The townsfolk accepted this explanation. After all, the boy had been sick before he came to Harlow. No doctor could save everyone. Then came Martha Dunham, a middle-aged woman known for her bright laugh. She suffered from headaches that had tormented her for months. Harlow gave her a crystalline powder dissolved in brandy, assuring her it would drive away the pain. She swallowed it eagerly, declared herself free of pain within minutes, and returned home, beaming. But the next morning, she was found lifeless in her bed, her hands clenched as though she had tried to claw something invisible from her throat. Again, Harlow offered calm explanation. An underlying weakness, a body too frail to sustain the cure. Her family wept but did not protest. How could they blame the doctor who had at least given her one night of joy? In the months that followed, the pattern grew clearer. Patients flocked to Harlow, received miraculous relief, and then, sometimes days, sometimes weeks later, died suddenly and strangely. Yet the deaths never seemed to dampen the town's trust. Harlow had explanations for all of them. Hidden conditions, old injuries, weaknesses of the heart. And because he had relieved their suffering, however briefly, families thanked him even as they buried their dead. Whispers began, of course. Some murmured that Harlow's cures were too strong, that his potions contained poisons. A few old women muttered of sorcery, of deals struck with the devil, but no one dared confront him openly. His eyes, those pale gray eyes, seemed to pierce through doubt, silencing suspicion before it could form into words. And besides, for every patient who died, there were others who swore themselves restored. It was Dr. Wyeth, frail and half-blind though he was, who voiced the first serious warning. He visited the parlor one evening, leaning on his cane, and watched as Harlow administered his glowing tonics. Later in private he told the pastor, "These are not medicines, these are experiments. He is not curing, he is testing." But Wyeth was dismissed as a jealous old man, envious of the younger doctor's brilliance. Meanwhile, Harlow's reputation only grew. Patients traveled from neighboring towns, filling his ledger with names and payments. He spoke of expanding his practice, of publishing his results for the medical journals of Boston. He smiled more, laughed at dinners, and raised glasses of wine to his beloved community. Yet those who looked closely saw the tremor in his hands, the way his gaze lingered on patients not with compassion, but with a scientist's cold hunger. Cold Spring had welcomed a savior. But in truth, they had invited a predator who clothed himself in the language of healing. And by the end of that first year, the graveyard on the hill had grown so crowded with fresh earth that the church sexton whispered he could no longer keep up with the digging. By the winter of 1882, Cold Spring was a town transformed. Its people no longer spoke of illness as an enduring curse, but as an inconvenience that could be swept away by Dr. Harlow's glass vials and steady hand. To the casual eye, the community seemed healthier than ever. Men returned to their work after months of infirmity. Women who had languished in pain found themselves smiling again, and children pale and coughing one week were running in the snow the next. Yet behind every burst of recovery lurked a funeral bell. The church graveyard filled faster than anyone could recall. The sexton, a bent old man named Luther James, complained that frost-hardened ground made digging difficult when there were 3, sometimes 4 burials in a single week. Still, families thanked Harlow at every service, clasping his hand with tears in their eyes. At least he didn't suffer, they would say. At least the pain was gone. It was a peculiar kind of gratitude, one that troubled the pastor, Reverend Cole. He watched his congregation grow smaller each season and felt a creeping unease. Harlow sat in the pews, head bowed, lips moving with silent prayers, yet something in his composure unsettled Cole. Unlike the weeping families, Harlow never seemed sorrowful. He looked upon the coffins with the same expression he wore when measuring powders in his vials. Calm, analytical, as though recording outcomes in a ledger invisible to all but himself. Suspicion smoldered in others too, though few dared voice it. Mothers whispered that their children, once cured, became restless, eyes wide at night, unable to sleep until their bodies finally collapsed. A farmer complained that his wife's relief came with a strange side effect. Her veins darkened, faintly visible beneath the skin, until she died suddenly in the field, clutching her chest. Yet when these concerns were raised, Harlow dismissed them with practiced ease. "Every treatment carries risk," he said. "But think of the relief they had before the end. Would you rather see them suffer longer?" And the families, torn between doubt and longing for comfort, chose silence. Only Dr. Wyeth, frail and failing, continued to protest. He muttered in the tavern that Harlow was no healer but an alchemist, blending poisons under the guise of medicine. "I know the smell of laudanum, of arsenic, of morphine," he hissed to anyone who would listen, "and I smell them in his parlor. But Wyeth's voice was weak, his reputation eroded by age. Few listened. To most, Harlow was a savior. Wyeth, a relic of outdated medicine. Harlow's practice grew bolder. He began keeping his patients longer in his home, insisting he must observe the effects of his latest mixtures. Neighbors whispered of screams muffled behind heavy curtains, of shadows moving late into the night. But those same neighbors returned to him when illness struck their families, desperate for even a chance at relief. The paradox of Cold Spring deepened. Suspicion and worship living side by side, neither strong enough to overcome the other. One evening in February, a tragedy too public to ignore shook the town. Clara Whitcomb, a beloved schoolteacher, had been battling a persistent cough. She visited Harlow and, before a gathering of curious onlookers, drank one of his emerald-colored tonics. Her laughter rang through the parlor minutes later, declaring herself free of pain. But scarcely an hour after leaving, as she walked home through the snowy street, Clara collapsed. Witnesses rushed to her side, but she was already gone, her face contorted, froth spilling from her lips. The crowd carried her body back to Harlow's house, demanding answers. And there he stood, framed in the doorway, pale eyes steady as ever. Her heart was weak, he said calmly. The excitement of relief may have been too much for her body to bear. But she died free of suffering, did she not? The crowd murmured uncertainly. Anger simmered, but grief muddled it. In the end, they left Clara's body with her family, and Harlow returned to his vials without consequence. The event left a mark, though. For the first time, whispers grew. Sharper, parents hesitated before sending children to his care. Men muttered in the tavern that Harlow was playing with forces beyond medicine. The Reverend delivered a sermon on false prophets, his voice trembling as he urged his flock to beware the cure that becomes a curse. But even then, when illness struck, the townsfolk returned to Harlow's door. It was in those days that young Thomas Briggs, the blacksmith's apprentice, grew suspicious enough to act. He had lost his mother to one of Harlow's treatments and refused to accept the doctor's explanation. At night, Thomas watched the brick house from the shadows of the forge. One evening he saw Harlow carrying crates into his cellar, their contents clinking like bottles. Another night, he swore he heard weeping from within, followed by the scrape of metal instruments. Driven by grief and anger, Thomas confided in Reverend Cole, who reluctantly agreed to accompany him. Under cover of darkness, the two crept to Harlow's home. They found the windows shuttered, the door locked. But in the back alley, a cellar vent was left ajar. From it drifted a smell both sharp and sweet, the odor of chemicals mixed with decay. Peering through, they glimpsed shelves lined with jars, and vials and what looked like bodies, pale forms beneath sheets. Laid out on tables as if awaiting dissection, they fled, shaken to their core. Cole urged caution, fearing what exposure might unleash. The town worships him, the Reverend warned. If we accuse without proof, they'll turn on us. Thomas, furious, demanded they act, but Cole's caution prevailed. For now, they kept their discovery secret. Meanwhile, Harlow unveiled new treatments, even more elaborate than before. He began speaking of progress, of cures that would outlast the patients themselves, of knowledge that could transform medicine forever. His voice took on a fervor that unsettled even his supporters. Where once he had been calm and clinical, now he spoke with the fire of a zealot, as if his experiments were not merely medical but spiritual. The deaths continued, each cloaked in the same explanation: weakness, frailty, inevitability, and Cold Spring continued to waver between devotion and doubt. But in the dark corners of taverns, in the hushed prayers of mothers, a question began to grow. Had they mistaken a healer for a harbinger? Was their savior in truth their executioner? By spring, the graveyard hill was nearly full. The sexton dug new rows along the slope, muttering that the dead now outnumbered the living. Yet still the townsfolk lined at Harlow's door, torn between fear and faith. For in Cold Spring, pain was a more terrifying enemy than death itself. And Harlow, with his glowing vials, offered the only relief they knew. But relief, they were beginning to learn, came at a cost measured not in coins, but in graves. Spring in Cold Spring should have been a season of renewal. The meadows along the river grew wildflowers, the orchard trees bloomed white, and children shed their winter coats to chase one another across the fields. But in 1882, the air felt different. Heavy, almost watchful. Families still smiled in the sunlight, but their eyes often drifted toward the center of town, where Dr. Nathaniel Harlow's brick house stood like a fortress. The doctor's reputation beyond the town had begun to spread. Travelers from neighboring villages arrived seeking relief from ailments their own physicians could not ease. They left clutching bottles of Harlow's shimmering tonics, boasting of immediate improvements. Some returned months later with gifts of money. Convinced they owed their lives to him, others never returned at all, their absence explained away by letters or hearsay. Cold Spring, eager for the prestige, welcomed the attention. To them, it seemed proof that their physician was destined for greatness, yet within the town itself unease grew sharper. Thomas Briggs, the blacksmith's apprentice, could not shake what he had glimpsed in Harlow's cellar. The Reverend Cole, though cautious, wrestled with his conscience. Each Sunday he stood before his thinning congregation, their faces worn by grief, and wondered if silence made him complicit. The church bell tolled more often than it ever had, ringing for funerals that seemed endless. In late April, another death forced whispers into near certainty. Jonathan Hale, a prosperous merchant, had suffered from arthritis so severe he could barely rise from his bed. Harlow treated him with a violet liquid poured into crystal glass. Within an hour, Hale stood upright, marveling at his newfound strength, walking the streets with a vigor he had not known in years. The town marveled, until 3 nights later, his wife found him lifeless in their parlor, his face twisted in pain, fingers blackened as though burned from within. At the funeral, Reverend Cole's sermon faltered. He spoke of God's mysteries but could not bring himself to utter Harlow's name. The doctor sat in the front row, hands folded, eyes steady, the faintest smile touching his lips when mourners thanked him for giving Hale a few good days. To Cole, that smile was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. Afterward, Thomas confronted him outside the churchyard. "Why do you let him stand among us?" the boy demanded. "Why do you let him kill us and call it mercy?" Cole placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice weary. "Because the people do not want the truth. They want relief. They would rather believe in salvation than face their fear. If I accuse him, I risk losing what little faith they still cling to." But Thomas would not be soothed. He began keeping notes, recording names, dates, and causes of death. He marked the pattern: miraculous recovery followed by sudden decline, always under Harlow's care. He swore he would gather enough proof to expose the doctor, even if it meant standing alone. That summer brought an event that shook even Harlow's most ardent supporters. A traveling circus arrived, bright banners unfurling against the sky, promising wonders to stir a weary community. Among its attractions was a young acrobat named Lillian, who dazzled the crowd with her daring leaps. During one performance, she fell, shattering her leg. Screams rose from the crowd until Dr. Harlow pushed forward, offering his aid. He carried her to his parlor, prepared a shimmering concoction, and gave it to her before an audience eager to witness another miracle. To their astonishment, she stood. Within the hour, walking with barely a limp, the crowd roared its approval. But that night, long after the circus had packed its tents, Lillian's cries echoed through the streets. She collapsed, her body writhing, foam flecking her lips. By dawn, she was dead. Unlike the townsfolk, the circus performers were not bound by gratitude. They accused Harlow of poisoning her, their voices fierce with anger. A brawl nearly erupted outside his home before the sheriff intervened. Though the sheriff urged calm, the performers left cursing the town for harboring a killer. Their words lingered, and for the first time, Cold Springs people felt shame beneath their devotion. Reverend Cole seized the moment in his next sermon. He spoke plainly. If salvation comes only at the price of death, it is no salvation at all. We must ask ourselves, is this man our healer, or is he the hand that digs our graves? The congregation shifted uneasily. Some nodded, their doubts finally finding voice. Others scowled, muttering that Cole was sowing division. But the seed was planted. Harlow, for his part, seemed unshaken. If anything, his confidence grew. He began speaking of progress in grander terms. telling patients they were participants in a great experiment that would change the course of medicine. "Pain is the enemy," he declared. "If death must follow its banishment, then so be it. Better to die without suffering than to live enslaved by it." Some found his words comforting, others found them chilling, but all drank his tonics, for the promise of relief outweighed the shadow of consequence. Thomas Briggs continued his investigation. He stole scraps of paper from Harlow's trash, notes scrawled with formulas and observations. Phrases like "subject tolerated dose" and "time until expiration" filled the margins. The words confirmed what Thomas already suspected. The townsfolk were not patients. They were experiments. One evening, Thomas brought his findings to Reverend Cole. The old man read the notes with trembling hands, his face pale. "This is enough," he whispered. "Enough to show them what he is." Yet when Sunday came, and Cole tried to present the evidence, fear overcame him. He looked at the faces of his congregation, so desperate for hope, and faltered. Instead, he tucked the notes into his Bible and delivered a sermon on endurance. Thomas left in fury. "Your silence kills them," he spat, storming from the church. Cole's eyes filled with tears, for he knew the boy was right. But his courage, worn thin by years of burying his flock, failed him once more. Meanwhile, Harlow's experiments grew riskier. He began combining treatments, layering powders and liquids into concoctions that hissed and smoked. Patients emerged glowing with energy, only to die more violently than before, choking, convulsing, even tearing at their own skin as though something inside them demanded escape. Families wept, but still thanked him, blinded by the relief that had preceded the horror. By autumn, the graveyard could hold no more. A new section of land was consecrated, its rows filling with alarming speed. The townsfolk murmured, but when illness struck, they still lined at Harlow's door. Pain, it seemed, was more terrifying than death, and Harlow knew it. He smiled at their desperation, his pale eyes gleaming as he raised his vials like a priest lifting chalice. Cold Spring was his congregation, and suffering was the altar upon which they sacrificed themselves. But not everyone bowed. In the dark corners of the forge, Thomas Briggs sharpened his resolve. If the town would not rise against the doctor, then he would, alone if necessary. For he had seen the truth others refused, that every cure was a death sentence, and Cold Spring was dying one glass at a time. Autumn 1882 weighed heavy on Cold Spring. The air smelled of smoke from wood stoves. The fields lay bare after harvest, and yet the graveyard hill looked busier than any barnyard. Coffins went into the earth with such frequency that even the children stopped asking whose turn it was. They already knew the answer. Someone who had once walked out of Dr. Harlow's parlor smiling, relieved of pain, only to be carried back to it days later in silence. Still, many defended him. "Better to die without agony," said Martha Bell, who had lost her husband to one of Harlow's violent drafts. He gave him peace at the end. The town began to rationalize its grief, weaving it into the very fabric of life, as though relief followed by sudden death was not a pattern, but a natural rhythm. To question it felt almost like blasphemy, but not to Thomas Briggs. The young blacksmith's apprentice grew restless, his notes filling page after page with names, causes, and timings. He counted more than 50 deaths since Harlow's arrival, far more than any town Cold Spring's size should endure. He begged Reverend Cole to speak out, to rally the townsfolk before the doctor claimed more lives. But Cole, racked with guilt, could only whisper, "I have no proof they will accept. They want to believe in him?" Thomas resolved to gather the proof himself. One moonless night he crept to Harlow's brick house, the forge hammer tucked in his belt for courage. He circled to the back, where the cellar vent yawned open. The smell was stronger now. Acrid, metallic, laced with the sickly sweetness of decay. Heart pounding, Thomas lowered himself into the darkness. The cellar was lit by oil lamps that burned low but steady. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with bottles of powders and liquids, their labels written in neat clinical script. Tables stood in rows, each covered with a white sheet. Beneath one, Thomas saw the unmistakable outline of a human form. His breath caught, but he pressed on. He lifted a sheet. The face beneath was pale, lips darkened, eyes open in a frozen stare. Jonathan Hale, the merchant who had walked the streets so proudly just months earlier. His body bore strange discolorations, veins traced black like ink beneath the skin. Thomas staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He turned to another table, pulled another sheet, another corpse, a farmer's wife. Her hands twisted as though she had died mid-scream. One by one, he lifted the covers. Each revealed the body of a townsfolk buried by rumor but not by earth. Harlow had not released them to their families at all. He had kept them, cataloged them, studied them. Each corpse bore marks of violence. Not the kind inflicted by weapon but by poison, by chemical fire that burned from within. Thomas stumbled toward a desk where papers lay scattered. Notes, meticulous and cold. Subject tolerated dose for 48 hours. Convulsions began at dawn. Heart failure followed. Another. Neural tonic effective for 6 days before delirium set in. Subject expired after 20 minutes of seizure. Page after page detailed the deaths not as tragedies, but as results. Rage consumed him. Harlow had not been careless. Or mistaken. He had been deliberate. Every patient had been an experiment. Every grave in the churchyard was a line in his ledger of progress. Before Thomas could flee, a voice echoed from the shadows. "You should not be here." Harlow stepped from the stairwell, his pale eyes glinting in the lamplight. He held no weapon, only a vial in one hand, but his presence alone rooted Thomas. To the spot. "You've killed them," Thomas spat, his voice trembling. "You call it healing, but you're killing us all." Harlow's expression did not change. "No, boy, I have relieved them. Their suffering ended before death claimed them. Can you say the same for the fevers and plagues that ravaged this town before I arrived?" He lifted the vial, tilting it so the liquid shimmered. "Pain is the enemy. Death is inevitable. I have simply closed the gap between the two." "They trusted you," Thomas hissed. "They trusted me to give them peace," Harlow replied. "And I did." Thomas raised his hammer, but his hand shook. Harlow's gaze pinned him, calm and relentless. "Strike, if you will," the doctor said softly. "But remember, when illness comes to your family, who will end their suffering? Will you watch them writhe in agony, or will you beg for the peace only I can grant?" The words struck deep. Thomas lowered the hammer, disgusted not at Harlow, but at himself for hesitating. In that moment of weakness, the doctor smiled faintly. "Leave, boy, say nothing. The town is not ready for truth. They would crucify you, not me." Thomas fled into the night, but the images of the cellar burned into him. He swore he would not remain silent. The next morning, he told Reverend Cole everything. The old pastor wept as Thomas described the corpses, the notes, the doctor's calm confession. "This cannot continue," Cole said. "If the town will not hear from me, they must hear from you." Together they planned to confront Harlow publicly, to force the town to face what they had chosen not to see. But fear gnawed at them both. Harlow's hold on Cold Spring was not merely medical. It was spiritual, born of desperation. To accuse him was to challenge the only hope the people believed they had. Their chance came sooner than expected. That week, another patient died violently after a treatment. A farmer named Samuel Price, whose fits of convulsion left claw marks on his own skin. His funeral drew nearly the whole town, Harlow standing at the front as though presiding over his own ceremony. When the service ended, Thomas stepped forward, voice shaking but strong. "Enough to carry. He is the one killing us," he shouted, pointing at Harlow. "He calls it cure, but I've seen the bodies he keeps. I've read his notes. We are nothing but experiments to him." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Harlow did not flinch. Instead, he lifted his hands, calm as ever. "This boy is frightened," he said evenly. "He mistakes the work of science for cruelty. Yes, I study. Yes, I learn. But every death I record teaches me how to end suffering for the living. Would you rather ignorance? Would you rather agony?" The crowd wavered, torn between outrage and devotion. Some murmured support for Thomas. Others clutched Harlow's hands, begging him to assure them they would not suffer. Reverend Cole raised his voice above them all. "Do not be deceived. A healer does not hoard corpses. A man of God does not trade life for knowledge. You follow not a physician, but a gravekeeper." The tension exploded into chaos. Shouts, cries, accusations flying in every direction. Harlow stood unmoved, his pale eyes sweeping the crowd like a judge. Finally, he spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. "If you believe me a murderer, then let me be judged. Bring your proof, bring your courage, but remember this. When your child lies in fever, when your wife cries in pain, do not come to me. Endure their screams if you can." The crowd fell. Silent. The coffin of Samuel Price stood between them all, a grim reminder of suffering and death. In the end, most turned away from Thomas and Cole, unwilling to sever their fragile lifeline of hope. That night, the church windows shattered under thrown stones, warnings left in the dirt. Do not defy the doctor. Cold Spring had chosen its healer, and in doing so, it had chosen its grave. Winter of 1882 came early, cloaking Cold Spring in snow before November was done. The river froze thick. The hills lay silent beneath white drifts, and smoke curled endlessly from chimneys. But the cold was nothing compared to the frost that settled over the hearts of Thomas Briggs and Reverend Cole. They had spoken the truth, risked everything to expose the doctor, and yet the town had turned against them. Whispers painted Thomas as a reckless boy, blinded by grief for his mother. The Reverend was dismissed as a bitter old preacher jealous of Harlow's influence and Harlow himself. He moved through the streets with serene composure, his boots crunching on snow, his hat tipped in greeting. Patients still lined his doorway, desperate for relief from winter's fevers and aching joints. Whatever doubts lingered were smothered by pain, and pain always drove them back to him. Thomas did not relent. He returned to the cellar night after night, keeping record of every jar, every body. The corpses multiplied, row upon row of townsfolk, preserved in strange chemical baths. He found marks carved into their skin, symbols like circles intersected with lines. At first he thought them wounds, but the precision was unmistakable. These were diagrams, experiments etched into flesh. He copied them into his notebook, though the sight of them made his stomach heave. One night, as he traced the markings with shaking fingers, he heard footsteps above. Harlow moved through the house, his voice low, speaking not to another man but to himself. Closer now, closer to the answer. If death is the cost of ending suffering, then I will pay it 1,000 times. His tone was fervent, almost worshipful, as though he prayed to some unseen master. The Reverend, too, carried his burden. He preached to pews half empty, his words thin against the weight of the doctor's shadow. In private, he confessed to Thomas that he feared not just for the town's body, but for its soul. "They no longer believe in God's mercy," he whispered. "They believe only in Harlow's vial. They kneel not at the altar, but at his parlor." The final break came with the death of young Abigail Turner, a child of 9 years. She had suffered from winter fever, her tiny body shivering beneath quilts. Her parents, frantic, carried her to Harlow. He gave her a golden tonic, its glow like sunlight in glass. Within minutes, Abigail sat up, her cheeks flushed with color, laughing weakly. Her parents cried with joy. But that night, as snow fell thick against the shutters, Abigail awoke screaming. She clawed at her arms, shrieking that insects crawled beneath her skin. Her father tried to hold her, but she convulsed violently, her small frame arching until bones cracked. By dawn, she was dead, her eyes glassy, her lips foamed white. The town mourned. But once again, Harlow stood calm, his explanation ready. Her fever had weakened her beyond repair, he said. I gave her relief in her final hours. Should we not thank God she did not die in agony? Many nodded, desperate to believe. But something in Abigail's death pierced deeper than others. A child's innocence, twisted into horror, left scars that excuses could not soothe. Thomas seized the moment. He stood at the burial, voice breaking, as he cried, "Look at her. Look at what his cures have done. How many more graves will you dig before you see him for what he is?" Some lowered their eyes in shame, but others shouted him down, insisting Harlow had tried his best. The crowd fractured, suspicion growing louder but still tangled in denial. That night, Thomas and Reverend Cole met in the church, the snow creaking. Against the stained glass, Thomas spread his notes across the altar. Names, deaths, diagrams, and confessions overheard. "This is enough," he said. "We must take it beyond Cold Spring, the law in Boston, the newspapers. They will listen if the town will not." Cole hesitated, his hands trembling. "If we go beyond these walls, Harlow will know, and he has followers here who would sooner kill than see him disgraced." "Then let them try," Thomas said bitterly. "I would rather die fighting him than digging another grave." They resolved to gather more evidence, enough to withstand doubt, but Harlow seemed always one step ahead. The very next day, Thomas's forge was found vandalized, iron scattered across the snow, his tools broken. A warning. The townsfolk muttered it was likely boys playing mischief, but Thomas knew better. And when he glimpsed Harlow watching him from across the square, eyes pale and unblinking, he felt the weight of a threat unspoken. The deaths continued into December. Each one followed the same pattern. Sudden relief, then violent decline. Families thanked Harlow even as they buried their dead, but for the first time, fewer hands reached for his vials. Doubt crept into the cracks of trust, spreading slowly. A healer should save lives, not end them in exchange for borrowed hours. Then came the snowstorm of Christmas Eve. Winds howled through Cold Spring, drifts burying fences and roads. In the chaos, a group of townsfolk claimed to have seen Harlow carrying something through the storm, a bundle shaped like a body slung over his shoulder, vanishing into the woods. Whispers raced through the town. Where was he taking it? Why in the dead of night? When the storm cleared, Thomas and Reverend Cole followed his tracks. They led deep into the forest, to a clearing where the snow lay disturbed. Beneath it, they unearthed frozen soil and discovered shallow graves. Bodies, half preserved by frost, stared upward with sightless eyes. Some were strangers, travelers who had come for treatment. Others were townsfolk believed long buried. The evidence was undeniable. Harlow was not only experimenting, he was hiding his failures in the woods. Thomas wanted to drag the bodies back to town, to force the truth upon their neighbors, but Cole urged caution. If we reveal this now, they will call it lies. We must be careful, deliberate, or we risk feeding his power. But fate was not careful. A week later, the sheriff's wife, Margaret Hollis, fell ill with pneumonia. Harlow treated her before a crowd in his parlor. She laughed with relief, breathing freely for the first time in days. The people cheered, their faith renewed. But by morning, Margaret was dead. Her lips blackened, her skin marbled with strange discoloration. The sheriff, broken with grief, turned on Harlow. For the first time, authority stood against him. "You killed her," the sheriff roared. "You killed my wife!" The crowd erupted, some siding with the sheriff, others clutching at Harlow, begging him to defend himself. The doctor raised his hands, calm even in the storm. "I did not kill her. I ended her suffering. If that is crime, then judge me guilty. But ask yourselves, who will save you when pain comes for you? Who will stand between you and agony?" The crowd splintered, divided. For the first time, Harlow's calm explanations faltered. The sheriff demanded his arrest, but his deputies refused, terrified of the townsfolk who still clung to their doctor. Cold Spring teetered on the edge of chaos, its faith in Harlow cracking but not yet broken. And in the forge, Thomas Briggs sharpened his hammer into a weapon, swearing the next time he stood before the doctor, he would not hesitate. The winter of 1883 was remembered not for its cold, but for its silence. The town of Cold Spring lived as though under siege. Neighbors no longer trusted one another fully, for every family had ties to Harlow in some form. Some swore by his cures, others whispered of his murders, but all feared the moment pain or fever struck their own homes. The sheriff, hollow-eyed from grief, tried to muster an arrest, but his authority crumbled in the face of division. Half the town argued that Harlow had murdered Margaret, the sheriff's wife. The other half insisted she had been doomed from the start, and the doctor had given her precious hours free from agony. The deputies refused to act, unwilling to risk civil war within the town itself. And Harlow? He remained composed, his door open, his parlor warm with lamplight, his vials ready for anyone desperate enough to drink. Reverend Cole pressed harder from the pulpit. His sermons grew fiery, warning of false prophets and wolves in sheep's clothing. He described the shallow graves in the woods, the corpses marked with diagrams, though he did not name Harlow directly, but his words stirred suspicion. Parishioners muttered afterward that Cole was meddling in matters of science he did not understand. Attendance dwindled further until the church, once the center of town life, felt like an empty shell. Thomas Briggs grew restless. His notebook brimmed with evidence, names, times, symptoms, markings, even sketches of the corpses found in the woods. He was convinced the town would never rise on its own. "We must take this to Boston," he urged the Reverend. "Let the newspapers tell the world. Let the law come down on him." Cole hesitated, his hands trembling as he clutched the boys. Notes: "If we expose him beyond these hills, do you know what will happen? They'll send men, yes, but they'll come not to arrest him. They'll come to take his knowledge, to use it, and his curse will spread beyond Cold Spring." Thomas argued late into the night, his fury growing. But the Reverend's caution prevailed. They waited, and the waiting nearly broke them. That spring, another wave of sickness swept the valley. Influenza spread from house to house, laying low children and old men alike. Fear drove the people back to Harlow's parlor in droves. He worked tirelessly, moving from patient to patient, mixing potions with steady hands, and the results were the same as ever. Miraculous recoveries followed by sudden, violent deaths. Coffins piled faster than snowdrifts, yet still families thanked him for easing their loved ones' suffering. For Thomas, the breaking point came with the death of Sarah Miller. A girl of his own age, she had come to the forge often, laughing as she brought her father's tools for repair. She was strong, lively, her cheeks always flushed with health. When influenza struck, her parents carried her to Harlow. She drank. His shimmering draft, rose from bed smiling, and swore she felt no more pain. 2 nights later, she screamed so loud the whole street awoke. Thomas rushed from the forge and saw her thrashing in the snow outside her house. Her eyes wide with terror, her hands clawing at her throat as though invisible fingers strangled her. By the time he reached her, she was gone, her face twisted in a mask of unspeakable fear. At her funeral, Thomas could no longer restrain himself. He stood beside the coffin and shouted at the mourners, "He killed her! You see the pattern! You bury your children while thanking the man who poisons them!" His voice cracked, his grief laid bare, but many turned away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others muttered that he had lost his senses, his grief for Sarah, blinding him to reason. Harlow himself stepped forward, his presence quiet but commanding. He laid a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his gray eyes calm. "You loved her, did you not?" he said softly, loud enough for all to hear. "Then be grateful her suffering was brief. She is at peace now. Would you wish her pain prolonged?" The crowd murmured their approval, nodding at the wisdom in his words. Thomas shook with rage, tears streaming down his face, but his protests dissolved into silence. That night, Thomas swore an oath. He would not wait for the town to awaken. He would strike Harlow down himself. Reverend Cole begged him to reconsider. "Violence will damn you, boy," the pastor said. "If you kill him without judgment, you become no better than he is." "No," Thomas replied, his jaw set. "I'll be better, because I will end him." Cole prayed for him, but the boy's heart was set. Meanwhile, Harlow's experiments grew bolder. He began keeping patients overnight, insisting he must monitor their progress. Those who entered his parlor at dusk often did not emerge until dawn, or at all. Strange sounds drifted through the night air. Moans, clinks of metal, the hiss of chemicals. Those few who peered through the shutters swore they saw flickering lights like fire, shadows of bodies twisting unnaturally against the walls. One evening in late May, the truth burst into the open. A fire broke out in Harlow's cellar, flames licking through the shutters. The townsfolk rushed with buckets, forming a line from the well. Smoke poured thick and black, but when they broke open the cellar door, they froze. Inside were rows of bodies, half-charred, strapped to tables, jars shattered, their contents bubbling on the floor. The air reeked of chemicals and burned flesh. In the corner stood Harlow, calm as ever, a wet cloth over his face. "Do not panic," he said evenly. "These were failures. Every science requires sacrifice." The crowd staggered back, horrified. For a moment it seemed they might turn on him at last. But then a woman stepped forward. Her son had been cured of crippling pain weeks earlier. She clutched Harlow's hand, tears running down her cheeks. "You saved him," she whispered. "You saved my boy." Others followed, voices rising in defense. "He healed my father. He gave my wife peace." Within minutes, the tide shifted. The horror of the seller was twisted into proof of his devotion, his willingness to bear the burden of sacrifice for their sake. The sheriff tried again to arrest him, but his deputies refused. The crowd, whipped into frenzy, threatened to riot if Harlow were taken. At last, the sheriff lowered his weapon, broken by his own people's betrayal. Harlow walked free. His pale eyes gleaming in the firelight, Thomas Briggs watched from the shadows, fists clenched. The town would never act. Their fear of pain was stronger than their fear of death. If Harlow was to be stopped, it would not be by law, nor by sermon. It would be by his hand alone. That night, beneath the stars, Thomas sharpened his hammer until its edge gleamed like a blade. He whispered Sarah's name, then the names of all the dead, and he swore the next time he faced the doctor, there would be no hesitation. Summer arrived in Cold Spring, but it brought no warmth to the hearts of its people. The air was heavy with the smell of lilacs from the churchyard, mingled with the sharper scent of lime poured over graves to hasten decay. It seemed every week the bell tolled for another funeral, and though the townsfolk still murmured thanks to Harlow for easing suffering, a new word began to slip into their whispers. Fear. They feared his eyes, pale and unblinking. They feared the way his hands never trembled, even when death raged before him. And most of all, they feared what they had seen in the cellar fire, that their neighbors, their kin had been strapped down like specimens, studied until life was wrung from them. Yet still they came. When pain gnawed too deeply, when fever stole breath, they found themselves at his door. It was as though the town was chained to him, unable to resist. Even as suspicion spread like rot beneath the surface, Thomas Briggs no longer waited for the town to wake. Each night, he shadowed Harlow, watching his movements, sketching his patterns. He saw him visit the cemetery long after. Midnight, standing among the graves, lips moving in words Thomas could not hear, he followed him into the woods, where the doctor dug shallow pits and buried glass vials wrapped in cloth. He even crept close enough to see Harlow lift his face to the moon, his expression rapturous, as though he drew strength from some presence beyond human sight. Reverend Cole, worn thin by doubt, tried to dissuade the boy. "If you go against him alone, he will destroy you. Wait for God's justice." "God's justice is too slow," Thomas replied bitterly. "How many more must die before heaven stirs?" Cole bowed his head, unable to answer. The breaking point came in July, when a wagon overturned on the main road. A family of travelers was pinned beneath it. Mother, father, and child. Harlow appeared within minutes, his bag in hand, his voice commanding calm. He dosed each with shimmering liquid, and within moments their cries quieted. The crowd cheered as the family stood, whole and smiling. But by nightfall, all three were dead. Their bodies were found stiff and cold in the inn where they had lodged, their faces locked in expressions of terror. The town gathered in the square, voices raised in outrage at last. For the first time, Harlow faced a tide not of gratitude, but of fury. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand on his revolver. "Enough," he said, his voice raw. "Doctor or no doctor, I'll see you answer." For this, Harlow stood calmly, his gray eyes sweeping the crowd. "You would arrest the only man who stands between you and agony?" he asked softly. "Then who among you will heal the sick? Who will stop the fevers? You bury your dead because I am not allowed to finish my work. You cut me short, and then blame me when death arrives." The crowd wavered, their anger dissolving into uncertainty. Mothers clutched children, old men coughed into handkerchiefs, and once again, pain outweighed rage. The sheriff lowered his gun. The people turned away. Thomas felt his stomach twist with disgust. He saw it then, as clear as the forge fire at night. Cold Spring would never rise against Harlow. Their fear of suffering had become worship. He was no longer just a physician to them. He was their priest, their prophet, their God of mercy in exchange for death. That night, Thomas resolved to act. He crept into Harlow's home, hammer in hand, ready to strike. The house was silent, the lamps extinguished, but in the cellar he found the doctor, waiting as though he had expected him. "You've come at last," Harlow said, his voice calm. "I wondered how long it would take before your rage outweighed your fear." Thomas tightened his grip on the hammer. "You kill us all and call it healing." "I save you from suffering," Harlow replied. "Do you think your God is kinder? He lets children waste in fever, mothers scream in childbirth, men rot from within. I give peace, swift, certain, merciful." "You call this mercy?" Thomas shouted. "They die screaming." Harlow's eyes gleamed. "Not all. Some pass in sleep, some in laughter, some in joy. A brief spark before the extinguishing. That is more than most are given." Thomas raised the hammer, his arms shaking with fury. But before he could strike, Harlow spoke again. "You think I kill for cruelty? No, I kill for knowledge, and knowledge will one day conquer death itself. These sacrifices are the foundation of something greater than you can imagine." The words froze Thomas. For a heartbeat, doubt flickered. What if the doctor truly believed this? What if his madness was born not of hatred but of conviction? Harlow stepped closer, unafraid of the hammer poised above him. "Strike me down, and you end a man. Let me continue, and perhaps you end death." Thomas faltered, and in that moment of hesitation, Harlow moved with sudden speed. He hurled a vial to the floor, shattering it. Acrid smoke filled the cellar, burning Thomas's eyes and lungs. He stumbled, coughing, his vision blurred. When the air cleared, Harlow was gone. The thaw. Next day, whispers spread that the doctor had left town. His house stood locked, his parlor empty, his vials vanished. Some rejoiced, believing the nightmare ended. Others wept, terrified they had lost their only defense against pain. But Thomas did not believe he was gone. He had seen the fervor in the doctor's eyes, the devotion to his dark science. Men like Harlow did not flee. They retreated to continue their work elsewhere. Reverend Cole shared his fear. "He is not finished," the pastor said gravely. "He has gone to find another flock, another Cold Spring, and they will not know what awaits them until it is too late." The town tried to heal, but the scars remained. Families mourned children, parents, lovers. The forge stood cold, the church half empty, and though Harlow's house lay abandoned, some swore they saw lights flickering in its cellar at night, or pale eyes watching from the trees. Thomas kept his hammer by his bed, waiting, for he knew the doctor who cured patients into the grave was not finished. He was only moving to the next chapter of his dark gospel, and somewhere beyond the hills, in some unsuspecting town, a stranger with gray eyes and a leather bag was already knocking at another door. Dr. Nathaniel Harlow vanished from Cold Spring. Like smoke blown from a fire, one day his parlor was full of bottles, his ledger open upon the desk. The next it stood hollow, stripped bare, the shutters drawn as though the house itself wished to forget him. The people of Cold Spring did not speak of him in the streets. They buried their dead, boarded up his home, and tried to fold their grief into silence. But silence was a thin blanket. At night, mothers woke in cold sweats, hearing again the screams of children consumed by invisible fire. Men dreamt of the cellar, of pale corpses laid out as though waiting for a resurrection that never came. Reverend Cole told his congregation that evil had been driven from their midst, yet his sermons trembled with doubt. Thomas Briggs alone refused the comfort of forgetting. He knew the doctor had not fled in shame. He had moved on, seeking a new place to continue his work. And he was right. By the spring of 1884, rumors drifted in from neighboring towns. A stranger had arrived in Ashford Hollow, a small mill village, 2 valleys away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair silvering at the temples and eyes like stormlight. He carried a leather bag and spoke of cures beyond the reach of ordinary physicians. At first, the villagers regarded him with suspicion. But when he cured the mill foreman's daughter of a fever that had raged for weeks, suspicion melted into awe. Soon, stories spread of men crippled by injury who walked again after a single dose of his medicine, of women freed from years of pain, of children who stopped coughing blood. His parlor filled with the desperate, and his name was spoken in reverent tones. Dr. Nathaniel Harlow. Back in Cold Spring, Thomas heard these stories and felt his blood run cold. "It begins again," he told Reverend Cole. "Another town, another graveyard waiting to be filled." Cole nodded grimly. "Then you must go to them. Warn them before it is too late." Thomas hesitated. He was barely 19, a blacksmith's apprentice with nothing but a hammer and a notebook. Who would listen to him when whole towns had bowed before the doctor? But then he remembered Sarah Miller's eyes as life left her, and Abigail Turner's small body twisted in pain. His fear hardened into resolve. He packed his notebook, his hammer, and a bundle of food, and set out on the road to Ashford Hollow. The journey took 2 days through thick woods and winding trails. Along the way, he passed strangers who spoke of the miraculous physician with awe. A woman claimed Harlow had restored her hearing. A man said his brother, once bent with arthritis, now swung an axe with the vigor of youth. Each testimony was another nail in Thomas's fury. He had seen the end of such miracles. They would not believe him until it was too late. When he reached Ashford Hollow, the scene was all too familiar. Harlow's parlor stood at the center of the village, its windows aglow with lamplight, its door crowded with patients. Thomas lingered at the edges, listening. The villagers spoke of the doctor, as though he were a savior. Children skipped about singing rhymes of "the man who takes the hurt away." Men tipped their hats when he passed, and women smiled as though at a holy man. Thomas pushed through the crowd one evening, his voice loud. "Do not trust him. He cured my town, and now half of them lie in the ground." Heads turned, but instead of anger he was met with laughter. "Another jealous quack," someone muttered. "Or a boy who lost his wits." Harlow himself appeared in the doorway, his eyes falling upon Thomas with recognition and calm amusement. "Ah," he said softly, his voice carrying through the hush. "The blacksmith's apprentice from Cold Spring still chasing shadows?" Thomas's face burned with fury. "You kill them. You poison them and call it cure. I saw your cellar, your corpses." Harlow raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "This boy has suffered greatly," he said gently. "He lost his mother to illness. He lost his sweetheart to fever. He sees in me the enemy he cannot strike in God. Do not blame him." The crowd murmured sympathy, for Harlow, not for Thomas. Strong hands shoved the boy away from the door. "Leave the doctor be," someone growled. That night, Thomas scrawled new entries in his notebook, recording every word, every face. He swore he would gather proof again. But Ashford Hollow was no different from Cold Spring. They would not see, until the graves piled high, and the graves did come. Within weeks, the first deaths began. Sudden, violent, inexplicable. A woman who had walked proudly from the parlor collapsed days later, her veins blackened. A boy who had been cured of a wasting cough screamed himself into madness before his heart gave out. But just as before, Harlow's calm explanation soothed the living. "They were already doomed," he said. "I gave them peace before the end." And the people nodded, grateful through their tears. Thomas tried again to raise his voice, but each time he was shouted down, dismissed, or even threatened. One night, he returned to his rented room to find his notes scattered, his pages torn, his warnings smeared into illegibility. Harlow had followers here too, and they would not allow his gospel of cure through death to be challenged. Still, Thomas did not yield. He watched, he recorded, he waited. And one night, through a window left unshuttered, he saw what he had come for. Harlow stood in his parlor, mixing a new concoction. Before him sat a young girl, pale and trembling. He poured a glowing liquid into a glass, his hand steady, his expression serene. As the girl drank, Thomas saw her body stiffen, her eyes widen, her mouth twist in pain. She collapsed, writhing on the floor, while Harlow calmly observed, jotting notes as though in a lecture hall. Thomas's fury boiled over. He pounded on the door, shouting for the neighbors. They came running, faces pale as they saw the child convulsing. But Harlow turned to them with measured calm. "Do not fear," he said. "This is the course of the illness, not my medicine. I am studying it to save the rest of you." And, as always, they believed him. Thomas was dragged into the street, beaten, and warned to leave the town. Yet as he lay in the dirt, blood on his lips, he whispered to himself, "I will not stop. I will follow him until the end," for he knew what few dared admit. Harlow was not simply a doctor gone astray. He was a prophet of pain, a man convinced his cruel science was salvation, and as long as he walked free, no town in America was safe. By the end of 1884, Ashford Hollow had become a mirror of Cold Spring. The graves multiplied, yet the parlor remained full. Mothers whispered prayers as their children swallowed Harlow's glowing drafts. Fathers clasped his hand with desperate gratitude, and the town's leaders defended him as though defending their own survival. But beneath the surface, doubt stirred. A handful of villagers whispered of the boy who shouted warnings. The blacksmith's apprentice who trailed the doctor like a shadow. Some began to watch more closely. The pattern of cures followed by sudden deaths, the strange discolorations on the corpses, the unnerving way Harlow recorded every symptom in meticulous detail. It was one such whisper that reached Thomas's ears, an innkeeper's daughter, Anna, who had lost her brother to one of Harlow's tonics. She sought Thomas out, trembling as she spoke. "They say you saw what he truly is. If so, help me. Stop him. My brother was not sick until the doctor touched him." At last, Thomas was not alone. Together they gathered others who had suffered under Harlow's hand, families who had buried loved ones, villagers who had begun to suspect the truth. They met in secret, in barns and back rooms, poring over Thomas's notebooks by lantern light. For the first time since Cold Spring, Thomas felt hope flicker. Perhaps here in Ashford Hollow, the people would rise. But Harlow was not blind. He noticed the shifting eyes, the quiet gatherings, the mutters that spread after each funeral. And unlike in Cold Spring, he did not wait for his authority to wane. He struck first. One morning, the village awoke to find Anna's father, who had been among the loudest doubters, lying dead in the square. His body bore strange burns along the veins, his mouth twisted in terror. A note pinned to his chest read, "Pain is worse than death, remember this." The message was clear. Doubt him, and you would not merely suffer. You would be made into an example. Fear gripped the village once more, but Thomas refused to be cowed. He rallied his small band, urging them to act. "We cannot wait for more graves," he told them. "We must show them what he hides. We must drag his truth into the open." They devised a plan. During one of Harlow's public healing sessions, Thomas would confront him not with words, but with proof. They would break into his cellar, drag his experiments into the square, and force the people to see. The night before their plan, Thomas crept again to the doctor's house. Through the cellar window, he saw shelves of bottles, rows of journals, and once more, bodies laid out beneath sheets. He slipped inside, his heart pounding, and seized one of the journals. Its pages were filled with diagrams of organs, sketches of veins traced in ink, and notes written in Harlow's precise hand. Subject consumed 4 ounces, convulsions lasted 12 minutes, expiration swift, relief absolute. He carried the book back to Anna, who read with shaking hands. "This is enough," she whispered. "Even the blind must see." The next evening, the parlor was full. Families pressed shoulder to shoulder, watching as Harlow prepared a shimmering green tonic. The doctor's voice was calm, his presence commanding, his every movement precise. He handed the glass to a farmer's wife, who drank and sighed in relief. The crowd murmured in awe. It was then that Thomas stepped forward, the journal in his hands. His voice rang out, Look what he writes of you." He held the pages high, reading aloud the cold observations, the tally of deaths, the reduction of neighbors into subjects and results. His words echoed through the parlor, and the people froze. For the first time, Harlow faltered. His gray eyes narrowed, his lips pressed thin. He stepped forward, his voice low but cutting. "This boy twists my work into cruelty. But what is cruelty? To let you suffer when relief is within reach? To withhold the chance of peace because the ignorant cannot grasp its cost?" The room trembled with unease. Mothers clutched children. Men shifted their weight, uncertain. Thomas pressed on, his voice rising. "Peace is not poison. Healing does not leave bodies in graves. He is no doctor. He is a butcher with a ledger." A murmur of agreement rippled, faint but growing. Harlow's eyes flashed. For the first time, anger cracked his calm facade. "You dare?" he hissed. "You, a boy who knows nothing of medicine, nothing of sacrifice." He seized a vial from the table, holding it aloft. "This is salvation. This is mercy. Without it, you are slaves to agony. With it, you are free, even if death follows. Is freedom not worth the cost?" The crowd wavered. Some nodded, their eyes wet with gratitude. Others recoiled, horror dawning at last. And in that fracture, the truth clawed upward like roots breaking stone. Then chaos erupted. One of Thomas's allies, a grieving father, lunged at Harlow, knocking the vial from his hand. It shattered, releasing acrid smoke that sent the crowd coughing. In the confusion, Thomas shouted, "To the cellar, see what he hides." The mob surged, doors splintered, lamps overturned, voices shouted. They spilled into the cellar, and there, under lamplight, the truth was undeniable. Bodies lay on tables, their skin etched with diagrams, their veins stained by strange chemicals. Shelves groaned with jars of preserved organs, each labeled with cold precision. Screams filled the air. Women fainted, men gagged, children wept. The illusion of mercy collapsed into horror. And through it all, Harlow stood at the top of the stairs, his face unreadable. "You fools," he said softly. "You would rather endure agony than accept the price of relief. Very well, suffer. Then, I will find others who understand." The crowd surged toward him, but he moved with uncanny speed. He hurled another vial, and smoke swallowed the stairwell. When it cleared, he was gone. Ashford Hollow was left in chaos. Some wanted to pursue him, to hunt him down. Others fell to their knees, weeping for the lies they had believed. Thomas stood among the bodies, his notebook clutched tight, his voice hoarse as he swore, "I will follow him. Wherever he goes, I will follow." And beyond the hills, the pale-eyed doctor walked once more into the wilderness, his bag heavy with vials, his heart unshaken. For to him, the deaths of Ashford Hollow were not tragedy, but triumph, proof that his gospel would always find believers. Dr. Nathaniel Harlow vanished from Ashford Hollow as swiftly as he had from Cold Spring. Once again, his parlor stood empty. Shelves, stripped bare, his journals taken, his patients left with nothing but grief and bewilderment. But this time, he left behind something else. Fear sharpened into anger. The villagers, no longer blinded, swore his name would be cursed through the valley. Men formed search parties, though they found nothing but footprints leading into the endless woods. Harlow had slipped through their fingers, as though the earth itself had swallowed him. For Thomas Briggs, the departure brought no relief. He had seen it twice now, a town ensnared, drained, then abandoned like a husk. He knew it would not end until the man was stopped. The others who had risen with him in Ashford Hollow begged him to stay, to help rebuild, to heal the wounds the doctor had carved. But Thomas's heart was set. "If I stay," he said, "he will only take another town, and another, until no one is safe." He left within days, following rumors as one might follow smoke after fire. Some said Harlow was headed north toward the cities. Others whispered he had gone west, to the mining towns where law was thin and desperation thick. Thomas trusted no rumor fully, but he carried his notebook, his hammer, and his oath. He would chase the doctor until the world itself closed its doors. For months he wandered. He heard fragments of stories. A healer in Vermont who vanished after a series of unexplained deaths. A doctor in Ohio whose patients recovered miraculously before dying suddenly weeks later. A stranger on a train selling tonics of relief. Each story bore the same fingerprints. Thomas followed each lead, often arriving too late, finding only graves and whispered thanks that had already curdled into horror. By the winter of 1885, his pursuit brought him to the cold towns of Pennsylvania. There, miners spoke of a physician who worked miracles on men broken by cave-ins and black lung. He charged nothing, asking only to observe their recoveries. At first, Thomas thought it must be another quack, but then he heard the words that made his blood freeze. Gray eyes like stormlight, hands steady as stone. He had found him. The mining town of Braddock's Hollow was desperate. The work chewed men alive, filling their lungs with soot, crushing their bones, leaving them coughing blood in the taverns at night. When Harlow arrived, it was as though God himself had descended. His drafts cleared lungs, steadied limbs, dulled pain. Men who had been carried from the mines returned to work within days, swearing they had been reborn. Their families sang his praises, and the mine owners welcomed him too. He returned broken men to labor, saving them money. But the graves came, as they always did. First a trickle, then a flood. Men collapsed deep in the shafts, their veins blackened, their mouths foaming. Some went mad, swinging picks at their fellows before dropping dead themselves. Still, the cycle held. Relief, gratitude, sudden death, and the calm explanation from the doctor who claimed it was fate. Thomas entered the town quietly, posing as a laborer. He spent weeks gathering testimony, scribbling names into his notebook. The pattern was unmistakable. He showed his notes to the priest, Father Brennan, who frowned but shook his head. "The people will not believe you, boy. They see him as a blessing, and blessings are not questioned." But Thomas could not remain silent. He confronted Harlow one night in the tavern, slamming his notebook upon the table. "You kill them," he hissed, his voice carrying through the smoky air. "You've killed hundreds, and still you call yourself healer." The tavern fell silent. All eyes turned to the doctor. Harlow looked up slowly, his gray eyes meeting Thomas's without surprise. A faint smile touched his lips. "Ah, the apprentice still follows." He closed the ledger before him with deliberate calm. "Do you tire of this hunt, boy? Or does vengeance fuel you still?" "Vengeance?" Thomas spat. "No, Justice." Harlow tilted his head. "Justice is a word men use when they fear truth, and the truth is simple. Pain is the enemy. Death is mercy. You cannot see it, but one day the world will." The miners muttered uneasily. Some frowned at Harlow's words. Others nodded, desperate to believe. Thomas raised his voice, his hand striking the notebook. Look at what he writes. You are not patients. You are subjects. Experiments. To him, you are not men but pages in his book." But the crowd, torn between gratitude and horror, faltered. One man shouted, "He saved me from pain." Another cried, "And my brother's dead because of him." The tavern erupted in argument, fists slamming tables, voices clashing. Through it all, Harlow sat unmoved, his gaze fixed on Thomas. When the noise grew unbearable, he spoke once, softly, and the room stilled. "You think to end me with words, but you cannot kill an idea, boy. I will outlive you, not in body, but in faith. As long as there is suffering, there will be those who drink what I offer, and they will thank me for it." Then he stood, leaving his glass untouched, and walked into the night. The crowd splintered. Some followed him, clutching their children, begging for treatment. Others stayed with Thomas, their eyes wide with fear. A few asked to see the journal, to know the truth. For the first time, cracks appeared in Harlow's dominion. Thomas knew then what he had long feared. He could not kill Harlow with words alone. He would need to face him with iron and resolve. He returned to his room that night, hammer on the table, notebook open before him. He whispered the names of the dead, one by one, until dawn came pale over the hills. And when the sun rose, he swore anew. If the world would not rise against the doctor, then he would, alone if need be. And somewhere in the shadowed streets of Braddock's Hollow, Dr. Nathaniel Harlow prepared his next draft, his next experiment, his next body for the grave. His gospel of mercy through death was far from finished. The winter wind cut through Braddock's Hollow, carrying soot from the mines and whispers from the taverns. The people were divided, torn between awe of the doctor who ended their pain and dread of the graves that followed his visits. Families argued behind closed doors, some clutching Harlow's tonics like holy relics, others hiding them away as poison. The town teetered, just as Cold Spring had, just as Ashford Hollow had, on the edge of surrender to despair. Thomas Briggs knew time was running thin. Harlow's hold on the miners grew daily, his calm voice soothing their fear even as their numbers thinned. If the town did not act soon, it too would be swallowed by his gospel. But the boy, no longer boy really, but a hardened young man shaped by years of pursuit, understood what words and sermons could not do. He went to Father Brennan one last time, notebook in hand. "I have tracked him across 2 valleys, 2 towns. I have seen the graves. I have read his notes. If Braddock's Hollow waits, you will all share the same fate. I cannot stop him alone." The priest sighed, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "Perhaps you cannot stop him at all. Perhaps he is more than man." Thomas slammed the hammer onto the table, the iron ringing through the small rectory. "Then I will strike him down anyway, man or demon, I will end him." Word spread quickly. Some laughed at Thomas's vow, calling him mad. Others whispered with hope, wondering if he might succeed. Where law and faith had failed, and a few, silent but steady, pledged themselves to his side. Anna, the innkeeper's daughter from Ashford Hollow, had followed him to Braddock's Hollow. She pressed his hand. "If you fall, you will not fall alone." The final confrontation came on a night thick with snow, when Harlow gathered a crowd in the parlor of a boarding house. He promised a new cure, one that would not only ease suffering, but extend life itself. A draft against time, he called it, his voice a hypnotic cadence. The room was packed, miners with blackened lungs, mothers with sick children, wives clutching the hands of husbands broken by toil. Thomas burst through the door, hammer raised, notebook in the other hand. His voice thundered above the murmurs. "Do not drink, you have seen the graves, you know the truth. He does not save you. He studies you. He cures you into the grave." The crowd froze, torn between fear and devotion. Harlow did not flinch, his gray eyes fixed on Thomas, calm as always. "You again," he said softly. "The boy who would chase me into eternity. You cannot stop me. The world will always want what I give." Thomas's grip tightened. "Then I'll take from you what the world cannot afford, your life." He lunged. The hammer swung, iron whistling through the air. Harlow moved with uncanny speed, hurling a vial that shattered against the wall, releasing acrid fumes. Chaos erupted, screams, coughing, bodies pushing toward the exits. But Thomas pressed forward, eyes burning through the smoke. The hammer struck the doctor's arm, shattering glass, sending liquid spilling across the floor. Harlow staggered, his calm cracked for the first time. "You fool," he hissed. "You waste the cure that could have saved generations." Thomas raised the hammer again. "No more graves," he spat, and with a final swing he brought it down. The blow echoed like thunder. Harlow collapsed, the light fading from his storm-gray eyes. The vials scattered, their contents seeping into the floorboards. For a moment, silence fell, broken only by the crackle of spilled chemicals eating into wood. The people stared, stunned. Some wept, clutching the tonics they would never drink again. Others dropped them, shattering glass against the floor. Slowly, a realization spread like dawn. The man they had worshipped was only a man after all. Father Brennan stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on Thomas's shoulder. "It is finished." But Thomas knew it was not. He had killed the doctor, yes, but he had not killed the idea. Already he saw it in their eyes, the longing for relief, the memory of pain lifted, however briefly. Somewhere, someday, another Harlow would rise. Another voice would promise mercy through death. He closed his notebook, its pages filled with names, dates, and horrors. He would keep it always, not as a record of vengeance, but as a warning. "So long as people fear pain more than death," he whispered, "his work will never truly die." Snow fell thick outside, muffling the town in silence. Miners trudged home, mothers held their children close, and the parlor where Harlow had preached his gospel lay in ruins. Thomas Briggs stood in the doorway, hammer at his side, and felt neither triumph nor peace, only the weight of an unfinished war. For though the doctor lay dead, the graves he had filled would never be emptied, and the world, hungry for mercy at any cost, would always open its doors to men like him.